Markus, for a wonderful, rational reconstruction of Hegel. In a way, you've made Hegel perhaps better than Hegel himself. You've succeeded in out-Hegeling Hegel.
We'll see that.
But let me ask a question to broaden the framework a little bit. Isn't there, to use a fraught metaphor, still an elephant in the room insofar as once one rationally reconstructs Hegel and intentionally abstracts from some of his quite avowed metaphysical intentions about the way the world works and the way reality works? These are considerations you bracketed in your talk for the sake of stressing the idea of the principle of intelligibility. Aren't we, in a sense, normalizing Hegel? Maybe there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe this is the way to go with 21st century Hegel interpretation. But of course, at times he's quite explicit in the preface to The Science of Logic. He talks about, well, what you're about to read is the thoughts of God before he created the world, etc. There are other indications to this effect. He describes the philosophy of nature as Geist in its otherness, which does suggest some kind of a priori, conceptual foundation or even metaphysical foundation of reality. I mean, isn't there a different dimension of Hegel that's much more solidary with the tradition of metaphysics, with Platonism, etc., that, and how one grapples with this aspect of Hegel in a contemporary context, of course, is open to debate. But, I'm also bridling against some of the contemporary American reception of Hegel. One could discuss it as a Hegel Renaissance, where one has, one does normalize Hegel, in fact, in terms of this notion of community standards and what's appropriate for a community. This is kind of the broadening of Hegel's perspective vis-a-vis Kant's subjectivism, subjective idealism, and this kind of extrudes also the transcendent dimension of Hegel, whereas truth isn't just what one would agree upon, but has an emphatic dimension that's very important for his approach to philosophizing.
Well, of course, when it comes to the details, I would argue that many passages which seem to speak in favor of a first-order metaphysical reading in the way in which I've defined the term, many of those passages are either ironical or fit into the picture if you look at their context. For instance, the God passage that he says, man könnte sich so ausdrücken. In a manner of speaking. This is how he introduces it himself. And many other passages, for instance, like Hegel says God all the time. So, many God fans would say, well, Hegel's one of us. And he says God all the time. But in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel explicitly writes that God has no meaning unless you say what you mean by it. So, and then he says, well, I'm telling you what you have to mean by God. This is part of his strategy of critiquing religion. So I think that Hegel has this interesting strategy of overcoming religion, which is not the Enlightenment strategy. So Hegel thought that there was a kind of Dawkins strand in the 17th to 19th century critique of religion. Religion is a superstitious explanation of natural phenomena. And Hegel thought that even though this might be true, this is not the right way of going about this. So if you want to bring religion to its knees, you have to look for a different strategy. So I read the God stuff, rationalizing the concept of God as strategical rather than as entangled. This is Heidegger's reading. Heidegger wants to read all these passages as evidence that Hegel is really a kind of even crazier Plotinus, say. Whereas I'm not even sure whether Plotinus is Plotinus in that sense. So I would try to argue that the normalizing reading is not just normalizing, it's not just a rational reconstruction, but that it really adequately captures what's going on historically. I would try to go this way. So I would take up this challenge rather than say, well, it's cherry picking. I only take from Hegel what I like, and then the rest doesn't really happen. The rest doesn't matter. I'm in a sense, I'm more radical. I'm saying the metaphysical Hegel in that sense doesn't exist. But I'm not deflating him Pippin style, So one tradition of deflating him, of course, from the which started in the late 80s with Roberts' 1989 book, of course, said that, oh yeah, Hegel is a Kantian, so this is why he's legit. And I think that so that's the picture. So, but I haven't shown this, right? So I'm just asserting it.
Yeah, thank you, Markus, very much for this very clear and helpful overview of all the main problems. I'm basically quite sympathetic with calling the Hegelian Enterprise a second-order enterprise. But I'm a bit confused, since I do think that would make more sense regarding the phenomenology of spirit than regarding the science of logic. I mean, usually when you have the result of the phenomenology, Hegel seems to think that we are fit now to conceive of the basic structures of thinking as the basic structures of reality. Now, if you recommend us to see that as a second-order enterprise, wouldn't the Kantian problem of the distinction between things in itself and appearances come back again? And doesn't leave thus doesn't force us to take the only position that the science of logic itself has to be, in some sense at least, a first-order enterprise.
Well, so in a certain sense, I endorse that view, but I think that the crucial difference there is that Hegel thinks that there is no a priori limit. So there's some form-content stuff going on. For instance, he says, what is the science of logic? It's the realm of shadows. I read the realm of shadows metaphor there. That's certainly not a big commitment to Platonism, if he calls the science of logic the Reich der Schatten. So it's a cave commitment. I read this as saying that the science of logic is in need of what he calls Bewährung, confirmation. And the confirmation of the science of logic only happens in the encyclopedia. This is how I read this. And what he does in the encyclopedia is he operates on the level of the necessity of contingency, meaning I think Hegel is saying something like this: we can lay out the necessary framework for the principle of intelligibility, but whatever in nature and the spiritual realm meets the criteria cannot be deduced or known a priori, only in its broadest formal shape. This already gives us some grip, as I said, negative methodological verdicts in certain areas of thought. Say someone, a bad neuroconstructivist tells you something like, oh yeah, human cognition is limited, it's hardwired, this is why we can never really know what nature is. And forms, this would be incompatible with a negative methodological verdict. But you wouldn't go from there to, therefore, human sensibility is not just evolutionary adapted to its environment, but somehow trimmed a priori, etc. So it's the verdict. This is how I would go about this. So I think the science of logic is still a second order, in that it guarantees a framework for thinking, Gesetze des Denkens. And this only allows us to be sure that when we apply the laws of thinking in particular contexts, that there's nothing in the laws of thinking that makes them subjective. So if I reason that if I want 2 beers and someone tells me there's beer over there, then I should go, just a practical syllogism of modus ponens shape. Why does this work on reality? Hegel would say, well, because reality has the right logical form. It's not that reality contradicts or could provide us with counterexamples to logical forms. I think this is how I would read this. So I would go second order on the logic. But that's the price that I have to pay.
So I'm a bit worried that in understanding Hegel as doing this second order metaphysical thing, you sort of have him wanting to swim.
I see.
So it seems like, in a way, by introducing this distinction between metametaphysics and metaphysics, you're introducing something like the distinction that Hegel himself rejects in Kant between transcendental reflection or critique and substantive first-order cognition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's another version of Guido's point. Yeah, I would say that yes, so it would hinge on whether this is just the same view, whether this is logically equivalent or methodologically equivalent to what's going on in Kant or not, would hinge on Hegel's additional assumption that where Kant goes astray is when he adds more specific assumptions to the picture, such as there are 12 categories or synthetic a posteriori knowledge is empirical by these and these standards. So there would be disagreement, and the major disagreement would lie in how we draw the boundary. So Hegel would probably say that the way we draw the boundary between these two levels is not such that we can ever wind up with an a priori kind of distinction. For instance, we have to know something about nature in order to know that nature is not fully mental. So this is how. Whereas he thinks that would be a substantial distinction between the Kant that he's attacking and the view that he winds up with, even though the view that he winds up with, in some sense, has the Kantian shape. But you would still think it's swimming before getting into the water?
Well, I mean, so I'm just thinking about this criticism that Hegel, so well described Hegel, is making about incoherence of the unqualified instrument.
Yeah.
And the thought is something like, I still can't shake the worry that if you're doing metaphysics, you're already there. It's like you're already doing metaphysics. And so I may just not have taken in the substantive response.
I see. Yeah, okay, yeah. So the strategy is, avoiding the... here's how I try to avoid the problem. I give metaphysics, first, the discipline of first-order metaphysics, a particular meaning. So one way of saying what metaphysics is would be figuring out how things are in the broadest possible sense, say. But I wanted to I wanted to say that metaphysics is concerned with the furniture of reality in pretty much the contemporary sense of the term. So I wanted to read metaphysics as being engaged with, the composition of reality, etc. And then in the composition of all of reality. And then Hegel would not be doing that. You could also say, well, what I call metaphysics is what in a sophisticated sense one would want to call metaphysics. So a different way of going about this would be to say that, well, why call this terrible thing metaphysics? For X, Y, and Z reasons, we all know that one should not engage in that. And then Hegel might have given us additional reasons, but those would not be reasons of going metaphysical, but reasons for giving up on this form of distinction. That would be another way of reading it. The audience that I have in mind when putting it this way are really contemporary metaphysicians who do tend to think of metaphysics not just as studying very general structures, some do, but telling you something about the composition of fundamental reality or the furniture of reality or whatever metaphor there is. Yeah.
Thanks. It occurred to me that one implication of your project is that you're changing the Kant-Hegel dialogue and making it more interesting. But I have, I guess, just one general question about that. So you mentioned that one implication of reading Hegel's absolute idealism in this way is that you can see him as continuing the Kantian project of trying to articulate a certain kind of unity of reason in its theoretical and practical applications. So then that got me wondering to what extent, so what is the Kant relationship on your account? You mentioned in response to the first question that you don't want a deflationary reading of Hegel in Pippin's style. So what exactly is happening on your reading with this Kant-Hegel connection?
Well, I think basically what's going on is that Hegel holds a realistic ontology of facts. That's what I'm trying to attribute to him, and he's looking for the unification of reason on the level of ontology. I haven't used the word ontology a lot here, so that would have been a different story. I understand ontology to be the systematic investigation into the meaning of existence, or depending on methodological decisions, existence. And I think that Hegel is engaged in that, and that he's saying something like, well, if we want to know what it is for something to exist, we have to have an account of facts, and he thinks that there's an objective concept of truth. A fact is a truth, not a truth maker, and there are further commitments of this shape, and this is where he starts disagreeing with Kant. Or so he thinks. It always depends on how you then read Kant, which is why I was... But Hegel's perceived move away from Kant, I think, happens on that level too. So he doesn't think that, for instance, he explicitly rejects the idea that space and time are forms of intuition. He thinks space and time are out there, in any relevant sense of out there. But that, nevertheless, that doesn't violate the principle of intelligibility. I mean, Kant famously in the Transcendental Aesthetics argues that if space and time were out there, and then later adds this discussion of transcendental realism to the picture, then somehow we could know them. It's hard for me to figure out what his real reasons are, but there's this move in Kant, like they have to be forms of intuition, because only this way we can guarantee some kind of knowledge that we otherwise want to have. So. And Hegel rejects that. He thinks that there's no reason to believe that. So it's a very specific form of disagreement. Probably also because, he takes in the whole package. He doesn't, many of us, not all of us, but many of us want to divorce Kant from his most terrible commitments to transcendental idealism. Some of, you sometimes find them. They're not, let me put it like that, it's certainly not the majorities of Kant scholars or Kant-inspired philosophers embrace transcendental idealism. That's something that most people are trying to avoid. But Hegel rightly thinks that, well, this is very important for Kant. And so given that he disagrees on that level already, that's why, this is a deflationary account in a certain sense, but not, my needle is different from Robert's needle.
Yes, my question is about the role of causality. If metaphysics, as you understand it, somehow involves a metaphysical thesis about causality, since this correspondence, this isomorphism between the structures of the mind, the structure of knowledge on the one hand, and the structure of the world on the other hand, seems to need something that relates the two structures in the proper way. And the only thing that seems to capable to do this work seems to be causality. So, does metaphysics presuppose the metaphysical thesis of causality?
Well, I think that that's exactly the question that John Searle raised, interesting. But I think that Hegel is not a naturalist on that level. I mean, there's this account of this interesting neurological account in the Philosophy of Nature where Hegel talks about the organism and he talks about ganglia cells, etc. So he has some relevant story to tell, which is roughly in good shape about how how organisms fit into a natural environment such that some kind of representation arises in them, etc., etc. But I do not think that Hegel believes that the principle of intelligibility has anything in particular to do with causality. Here's why. Given that it's supposed to be a defense of a topic-neutral account of facts, then why think that if I know that Sandra is in pain and should be helped because she's lying there on the ground, why think that this is caused, my knowledge? Or why think that my knowledge that I'm a citizen of the German Federal, of the fact that I'm a citizen of the Federal Republic of Germany is caused? Why think of this in terms of causation? So I don't think that Hegel would look for causation there. His ontology of facts is topic neutral and certainly incompatible with some forms of naturalism that would make it look necessary or very motivated to go into causation here. So he really is an idealist after all, where this means that he can certainly not be a naturalist in metaphysics, in my understanding. So he would reject the terms of the question and say that, well, this might hold, you might wonder how this works on the level of perception, but philosophy is not primarily concerned with giving an account of perceptually based or knowledge. That would still be Erfahrungsphilosophie. Philosophie.
Well, I wanted to follow up on Hannah's question, which understand. I understood your answer now. I mean that with the thing with respect to which metaphysics in Hegel is meta is a kind of metaphysics which perhaps is pursued in certain areas of analytic philosophy. But perhaps that's too bad a project even to be meta about for Hegel. I mean, isn't he perhaps articulating an idea of metaphysics which would cast a very unfavorable light on that enterprise as opposed to being meta about it? I just wanted to say something about the significance of this passage in the phenomenology that Hannah was referring back to, and what I thought was the way in which it undermines the meta idea of philosophical knowledge as such. It's being in some way second level, and I thought that the description he gives of Kant, which may be unfair, is such that it represents Kant as thinking of the power of knowledge as akin to sensibility, in that there is a possibility of delimiting from outside its nature, and thereby the extension of the apprehension and cognition possible through it. And this is a proper conception of sensibility. I mean, every power of sensibility is an aspect of a given nature of an animal, a physis. It has a definite character to which corresponds a definite range of objects apprehended through it. There is an outside of it through which this limit can be thought. But what he says, I think, against this conception here is that knowledge is not like that. Knowledge is always already its own conception of itself as knowledge, and knowledge is its own measure. It is, in that way, an ultimate activity, something on which can... So any thought of knowledge as knowledge is not a second-order thought. It is that same thought. That's what I take to be the import of, this internality of knowledge, of being its own judge, right? And that as a distinctive, as a defining character of knowledge, which distinguishes, or intellect, or whatever that distinguishes it. And so the way in which this plays out in the principle of intelligibility, I think, is that it's perhaps slightly stronger. I think this principle is sound. You say there's no a priori ground of thinking of a given form of thought to be such that thinking according to this form is, in virtue of being according to this form, unsuitable to apprehend what is. But it's slightly stronger, I think. It's not only that a form of thought or a way of thinking or a conception is not internally such as to cut us off from what is. I think it's thought as thought of sort of understands itself as being of what is. I mean, it's not neutral. It's not. I mean, as you said, it's not highest common factor. It's not just the self-conception of a way of thinking is such that, well, thinking in this way is to think either truly or falsely. That's left undecided. But if we say that it's, we put this by saying that a form of thought sort of originally sort of conceives itself as a form by thinking in accordance with which we can know. I think so. That's the original idea. So a form of thought originally is a form of knowledge. Now in that case, that appears to me to be some conception of what is as internally, as it were, its ground in some manner must reside in its very intelligibility. That I would call that a metaphysical idea. In your term, it may be metaphysical, but I'm wondering, to come back to my original question, I'm wondering whether this is just to say something like, I'm sorry, one last sentence. This beautiful quote of Hegel, what it says about Thales, and he mentioned these guys, which are, as one with the materialists, right? They're water, atoms. What he thinks, no, really, what they what they do is they say there's one principle. And that's the form of their thought, it's one principle, water, that you don't see. Look around, do you see water everywhere? No. We go beyond anything that we see, it's all water. Now that kind of, manner of thinking, or it's all atoms, that's idealism. And that's the same what Aristotle says at the beginning of Book Gamma, where he says, these guys, these naturalists, as he calls them, the physikoi, who sought after the stocheia, furniture of the universe. What they really were after were the stocheia of what is insofar as it is. So twist it around.
Yeah, he goes from stocheia to archai.
Right. So I'm thinking whether you might not do the same and say, well, they want the furniture, but the stocheia, and they want the water. They think water, but.
One element of a defense of the applicability of that form of distinction between metaphysics and metametaphysics outside of the contemporary debate. So it's not just, what would Hegel have to say to a contemporary debate that some people in this room regard as misguided, me included. That is one question I am raising. But then Hegel would say that, if he were to accept this vocabulary, he would attribute metaphysics to people like Spinoza and Leibniz, etc. So he thinks that they are exactly in the business of what the German idealists all call dogmatism, as opposed to criticism. And dogmatism is the idea that what metaphysics does, or what philosophy does, rather, not to use the term, is we want to figure out how things are. And that means, in particular, abstracting away from the fact that we are trying to figure it out. So have a picture of the world without us in it, the world without spectators. And he says that view is, first of all, incomplete because you are part of that picture. So on that level already it doesn't work. That's my reading of the famous from substance to subject quotes in Hegel. Spinoza is substance, but we have to conceive of the absolute equally as subject, etc., etc. This is how I read this. So there's all sorts of agreement, but I wanted to say with that even in the historical context, Hegel is fighting the metaphysicians in that sense of the term. So they didn't come late. And the evidence, you mentioned Thales, etc. So, well, you might want, depending on how you read Aristotle and Plato also, you would say that, well, then metaphysics is exactly what they are not doing. They're trying to do metaphysics, but they're not doing metaphysics. But then you need a term for what they are doing. Our accounts would be very similar. Maybe you would be saying they're doing schmetaphysics and Hegel's doing metaphysics. It would be, and then you might not have the second order worries that you have. That discussion would be, like when it comes to self-consciousness, we would have to have that discussion when it comes to Hegel's account of knowledge. I think we would have to look in what's going on in the philosophy of subjective spirit. I think this would be the locus of discussion, because that's, in this context, Hegel tells us something about knowledge. And then also, there are all these worries, like he uses the word knowledge in the science of logic, he uses the word science, Wissenschaft, and he uses the word Erkenntnis. And what he thinks he's doing is Wissenschaft rather than Wissen. And Wissenschaft certainly on many levels has the form that you are describing as self-consciousness. So there's probably not a lot of disagreement there. It would depend on the details when we come to that. But I do think that some version of what I call metaphysics versus metametaphysics will be operative. You can have it one level down. Yeah.
Hegel wants to praise Thales, for example, is that he is, resisting the urge toward dogma or doctrine, and he's giving a critical account of, conditions of intelligibility. Let's say, to follow your line, the principle of intelligibility. If that's the case, wouldn't Thales be, giving an account of swimming before getting wet? I mean, I'm wondering how that fits with the other things that Hegel wants to say. I mean, it sounds like you want to resist the idea that the criticism-dogmatism or criticism-doctrine distinction that we get from Kant, and that Hegel seems to be employing here, is not congruent with, or does not map right onto the preparing swimming distinction, on the basis of which he criticizes Kant for not having gone far enough, say. So I'm wondering why they don't fit.
Yeah, well, on the swimming part, I mean, now I could make jokes, water, wet, swimming, but okay. I agree with Sebastian's way of putting it, that what's crucial for Hegel when he says idealism, I think, is exactly that. Let's call the good discipline ontology and agree on that. So I called the good discipline meta-metaphysics, and some people might be worried about this, depending on how, let's introduce a new term and call it ontology. And then I think that what Hegel is saying is if you do ontology, you're not primarily dealing with seeing things. If you think that seeing things is the relevant relation for giving an account of intentionality in general, then that is misguided. I think that is what Hegel is primarily attacking, the idea that when we are engaging in ontology or metaphysics in your sense or meta-metaphysics in my sense, what we are doing in the good discipline is, how can we see things? How does this work? What's the relation between causally active entities there and photoreceptors, or whatever version of it? Precisely because this would never give you the relevant form of generality, ever. And that's an argument you already find in Plato. That's the opening move of ontology in the Sophist and the Parmenides. And then Aristotle picks this up and applies it to the philosophy of nature, etc., etc. And Hegel stands in that tradition. So there, another form of agreement. But on the swimming, I do think that I think Hannah has made the point that in a certain sense, Kant, of course, is not trying to learn swimming before swimming, but that what Kant calls transcendental reflection is already swimming. So that certainly the unqualified instrument view does not at all apply to Kant, because he has a concept of transcendental reflection. And I think that Hegel might know this. He doesn't say a lot about this, but even where he would agree that Kant has some account there, say in the methodology chapter of the First Critique and elsewhere, even where Kant has such an account, it's insufficient. Because, like the standard questions that all German idealists raise, like what is it to know that there are 12 categories? Is this synthetic knowledge a priori? That would be odd. Is it synthetic knowledge a posteriori? Certainly not. Is it analytic? Like the four possible types of combining synthetic, the two forms of distinctions don't really apply to transcendental reflection. But then what is it? And then there are ways, there are solutions to the problem, and I think the solutions lie in Kant's doctrine of knowledge, Wissen, in the methodology chapter. So there are solutions to it, but it's certainly not the center of Kant's attention. And the German idealists want to say, and it should have been, because he's still working on a model of intentionality as, primarily anchored in a Newtonian-style physical world. So it still has the shape of a philosophy of perception. I think that's the worry that they have. And I mean, most people reading, why is he so worried with the knowability of nature in particular? Why is Erkenntnis particularly related to spatial, temporal individuals?
Thanks very much for a wonderful talk. I particularly like the sharp contradistinction between Hegel's idealism and the subjective and transcendental idealism, and the explanation of his critique of those two competitors. My problem, I guess, or my question is not about your reading of Hegel's criticisms. I think you give a wonderfully lucid account of what Hegel says is wrong with Kant's transcendental idealism. But my problem is rather with Hegel. And we've talked about aspects of this before, so I'll try to emphasize new aspects rather than just the old ones. So to start with this point about trying to learn to swim before entering the water and so on, So Hegel writes, the requirement is thus, one is supposed to cognize the faculty of cognition before cognizing anything. And he seems to be thinking there of this passage at the beginning of the Prolegomena, where Kant says, all metaphysicians are solemnly required to stop making synthetic a priori claims until they have investigated them and shown them to be legitimate, roughly. That's a very different thing from saying that we're going to give an investigation of cognition which doesn't involve any cognition. Completely different thing. I mean, it's a much more nuanced requirement or stipulation that Kant introduces. So that we've talked about that case. And as one could debate, does Hegel have a deeper line of thought there, or is it just a sort of misunderstanding Kant? And as you know, I think one can perhaps save him there. But the other case, though, is in a way even more fundamental, I think, and it's this business about the instrument and the medium in the phenomenology. I mean, one way of reading that is that discussion of Kant, insofar as it is a discussion of Kant, is that Kant's presupposing the idea of cognition as an instrument or perhaps a medium, and that leads willy-nilly to the impossibility of knowing things as they are independent of cognition. Hegel shows you why the very metaphors lead to that conclusion. And it would explain, therefore, why Kant adopts his transcendental idealism. The only things we can know are mind-dependent, depend on our instrument, our medium. We can't know things in themselves. So there's a certain sort of superficial plausibility to this as a diagnosis of how Kant gets to transcendental idealism. But again, if you actually go to Kant and you see what he argues, it's completely different. I mean, Kant rarely even uses these metaphors, and even then, in very indirect ways, actually. The person who does use them is Lambert, in the Nous Organon, it's the buzzword, instrument, new instrument. But Kant rarely uses them. You can find the odd passage where something like these metaphors with it. That's what the one side. But the more important side is, what's happened to all of Kant's real arguments for transcendental idealism? What's happened to the problem of synthetic a priori knowledge, say in mathematics, geometry in particular, and the puzzle of how we can have substantive, non-trivial knowledge, non-analytic knowledge is the technical term, in these domains in advance of any experience or independently of any experience? Answer: idealism. Space is actually not different from our mind. So that's how we can know all this wonderful substantive stuff, synthetic, in an a priori fashion. And there are related problems about the nature of the necessity involved in these synthetic a priori cognitions. How can there be such a necessity that's substantive, that's not merely analytic? Again, the answer is, it's constituted by this fact about the mind. Problems about the reference of a priori concepts, the dilemma that Kant already sets up in the letter to Hertz that leads to the transcendental deduction project. How can you have, in order to have a reference with a concept, you need causal relation one direction or another. Either causation of the concept by the object or causation of the object by the concept. Archetypal intellect would do that. It seems like these a priori concepts, like causation, fall into neither category. If they fell in the former, that would make them merely sensible concepts, which they're not. They're a priori. If they fell into they don't seem to be the latter either, then Kant's idealist solution is actually they do sort of fall into the latter category. So we have another motive for transcendental idealism here. So none of this plays any role in Hegel's representation. So the question would be, is Hegel just kind of misunderstanding stuff? Or is there some way of saving him from that appearance?
I do think that Hegel will probably, remarkably, there's not a lot of philosophy of mathematics in Hegel. So, and he nowhere takes up the challenge of these questions. So obviously there's some kind of skeptic that Hegel does not worry about and that Kant worries about. So even though, we can take it for granted that we know all these things, prolegomena, etc., the question is, how is it possible? And the how is a possible question on many levels is a response to certain perceived skeptical threats. Hegel thinks that the perceived skeptical threats go away after these revisions. So, but nevertheless, you might say, well, but then so I think this is why he doesn't say anything about this. But because he thinks he has a deeper line of thought that doesn't even get him to these kinds of problems, because I think from the passages where he talks about these things, in particular in the philosophy of nature, where he has and philosophy of subjective spirit, where he talks about the Kantian discussion of Anschauung and so forth, he presents it as if this was already the result of a bad reaction to skepticism. So if we have the right anti-skeptical strategy, we will never land in this camp. And then all he says, but you might nevertheless, of course, want to know, what about the philosophy of mathematics, And then there are a few passages which, in my reading, suggest that he's a logicist. I think that, Frege and Hegel do not only share an Ege, but that there's a substantial agreement there. But Hegel doesn't do a lot with it. But, like when pushed, he would probably say they're analytic a priori. This is how I would read him on it. But again, there's not a lot that he has to say about this. He has, of course, an account of the modalities in the science of logic. And there he engages with Kant explicitly, because Kant has this account of the modalities in the first critique, where he says that the modalities are relations between a thinker and her field of possible experience. Quite explicitly, to be necessary is to always be encountered in the field of possible experience. To be possible is to be compatible with the conditions that have to be met in order for something to be within the field of possible experience, and to be actual is to be encountered in the field of possible experience. So necessary is what's always actual, etc. So that's the account of modalities that we get in the first critique. And this for Hegel is utterly subjectivist in nature. Why think that, why restrict the modalities to, why only have a set of episteme? Well, it's odd, they're not really epistemic, but whatever they are, so there he disagrees with them. But then again, you might say, so I think his strategy would be to say that, no, those problems the Kantian problems don't really arise. If one really were to take a very close look at it, probably they disagree about, and this is where another sense in which both are very relevant to many contemporary discussions, I think they disagree about the scope of disagreement in philosophy. Kampfplatz ewiger Streitigkeiten, of course, is a huge Kantian motive for saying that we need a grounding of metaphysics before going on. We have the atoms in the void people, we have we have a number of people, and they have all different claims. And before we opt for one of them, we should sort our vocabulary. But while sorting it, of course, Kant can say, well, and we're cognizing something here, So there's disagreement about the nature and scope of disagreement, and the epistemological, skeptical, or potentially skeptical impact on the activity of philosophy. I think there's where the disagreement is. But then, of course, one would want to know, and what is your philosophy of mathematics, and what do you, Hegel, have to say about the relation, say, between number and gravity? And then Hegel leaves us alone. Also, if you look in the philosophy of nature, he doesn't give us any account of theory building. Like Hegel doesn't give you an account of physics. So either there is none, and that's a problem for him. I'm not decided on that issue. I haven't really looked into it. Or he has some kind of deep line of thought again that helps him not even asking the questions.
I find that quite helpful. In particular, it sort of suggests a sort of halfway between the two options I offered position, which is quite plausible, I think, namely that he thinks he has a sort of very fundamental problem for Kant, which allows him to do an end run around these, what he sees the details. And, you described this disagreement about the degree of disagreement in philosophy, and the form in which that comes up. More specifically, is this allegation that Kant is deeply implicated in Voraussetzungen, in presuppositions, which of course for Hegel means something very specific. It's making assumptions that are not based on ulterior grounds or deeper grounds, and running into the ancient skeptics problem of the equal right of the contrary presupposition. And so he constantly brings this up. And if you have that general worry, then maybe you don't need to look too closely at exactly which presuppositions are involved in this problematic of synthetic a priori, or knowledge, for example. So maybe something in the middle between, you know, just being misunderstanding and having a deeper answer is the right thing. He thinks he doesn't need to go into those details.
He thinks he has reasons not to care about those specific, you know, like for instance, if he's right, you can easily imagine how he has reasons for not trying to answer the question whether there are 12 or rather 13.5 categories. If he's right, he can say that it's arbitrary anyways, you know, that Kant comes up with a table of categories. This is what Hegel would then try to say. So why should he tell you that there are not 12 but more, if that's a misguided way of putting it? So that's one of the applications of the negative methodological verdicts. But you know, like that doesn't settle the issue. But I think this is the spirit in which he approaches these questions. But again, he does not really have a good philosophy of mathematics, to say the least, if any. I mean, there are only a few remarks, and they are generally dismissive. Oh.